As my first kind of official O'Neill Center event, I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to where Bob went, to Bob and Michael for convincing the dean here to hire me, and to the O'Neill family for setting up this center. I also owe the O'Neills a great thank you for the great product of Investors Business Daily. I do a weekly appearance on a local radio show down in Naples, Florida, and every week the host emails me and says, all right, we're going to, what do you want to talk about tomorrow? And I can't tell you how many times I've gone over to investors.com, clicked on opinion, and found excellent analysis of some public policy issue by some national expert, and I just send the link to the host and say, hey, let's talk about this. Makes my job a lot easier. So thank you for that as well. I have been working on economic freedom, broadly speaking, for about 2 decades now. Way back in 1991, as a fresh-faced 22-year-old graduate of Wake Forest University, rather than getting a real job, I decided I'd serve an internship at the Cato Institute. Best decision of my life, I would say, but I was making $700 a month, if I recall right. And I had the great fortune of being assigned to a man, to be an intern for a man, some of you probably know his name was Stephen Moore, and he was the director of fiscal policy studies at that time. And we did all sorts of stuff like this. He's moved on to, he's at Heritage now, and before that he was at that other business newspaper writing for their editorial page that I won't mention. But we did, when we were at there at Cato, we did every 2 years, and they still do this, but when we started it out back in the 90s, a fiscal policy report card of America's governors. So every 2 years we'd issue a report card, and it didn't take 24 hours before we started hearing from the governors, I can't believe you gave me a C, or I can't believe you gave me a D. I've never gotten a grade that low in my life. And they were lucky we graded on a curve, or they all would have failed. But the topic I want to talk about today is, all right, hold on, here we go, is of course economic freedom and how we measure it. And so I want to tell a little story briefly about how this all started. By far, my favorite economist is a man named Milton Friedman, won the Nobel Prize. A little brief story about one of the reasons why he's my favorite. The president of Cato at one point when I was an intern there gave me an assignment to put together some statistical measure. I can't remember the precise details, but at some point, Jim Dorn, who's the editor of Cato Journal, said, because I wasn't sure if I was doing it right, I said, why don't you just send a letter to Milton Friedman? And I gave him a double think. I was like, what? I'm like 25. Why would he care what I think? So I sent a letter to Milton Friedman because I was told that was a good idea. And a couple weeks later, sure enough, I got a nice letter from the Hoover Institution at Stanford University from Milton Friedman, which is still on my bulletin board to this day. And my wife to this day tells me the only reason she agreed to go out with me while we were both there working, we met when we were working at Cato, was because of the Friedman letter on my bulletin board. So he is my favorite economist. And I was going to send the dean the letter, but I never got around to it. So about, I think it was about 30 years ago or so, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, another Nobel-winning economist, a bunch of public policy experts, Bob Lawson was involved with this, got together and said, wouldn't it be great if we could measure quantitatively, come up with a number for the level of economic freedom in different countries, right? And so 10 years later, they published their first Economic Freedom of the World report. The Fraser Institute is the publisher of that report. And then a couple years down the road, the folks at Fraser said, well, wouldn't it be great if we could do this for the states too, or as they call them, provinces. So in 2002, the first Economic Freedom of North America was published by the Fraser Institute. I got involved with this a couple years back, and this will be my third report. We've been issuing them in December the past couple years, so I'm going to share with you some of the results from last December's report, which was the 10th edition. And for the first time, we call it Economic Freedom of North America. For the first time, it really is. We included the Mexican states side by side with the Canadian provinces and, of course, the U.S. states. And so a brief commercial for the report before I do that, and it's available at freetheworld.com. Last year, we got 513 media mentions of this report, exceeding our previous high by 79%. We've had put forth a great effort to kind of promote the report out there on local radio shows. We have professors all over the country doing that sort of thing. It's been cited in over 100 academic journals and public policy papers. Compared to the other state indices out there, we've been produced the longest. We're the only one really that's updated annually, and we have the most years of data, which is 32. And as, well, Bob's not here, as I like to needle Bob, we have more data than the economic freedom of the world. I think they've got about 20. But he says they're fixing that. The Economic Freedom of the World is a great report, and we're just kind of following in their coattails. So what is economic freedom? Here's the kind of a textbook definition. I like to call it simply the freedom of individuals, entrepreneurs, businesses, families, to use their resources, their money, their time as they see fit without excessive intervention from government policy. So I want to walk you through briefly, not too much detail, the index that we use to measure freedom in the states. Area 1 is size of government. Essentially, that's a bunch of measures of government spending. We take 3 different slices of the government budget. We look first at what we call consumption expenditure. So that's spending on goods and services. We look at transfers and subsidies, welfare payments, and that sort of thing. And then we look at, I'm going to rename this one because it's confusing to the U.S. audience, Social Security payments. That's a federal program, of course. But we look at the social insurance programs at the state level, state and local level, as well as the pension plans. So we take 3 different slices on spending. On taxes, we've got 4 different measures. Now, because income taxes are so destructive and so imposing on economic freedom, we do a separate variable where we just look at the top rate, so that top marginal rate. And then we have the 2 other slices of that, the indirect and the sales taxes. The third and last area, is what we call labor market freedom. So we take the minimum wage and we say, what if you're a full-time worker at this? So in other words, turn it into an annual income amount and just calculate that as a percentage of per capita GDP. We look at government employment, so what percentage of total employees work for the government in the state? And then union density, what percentage of the workforce is unionized? So in each of those areas, or for each of those variables, I should say, we give them a value of 0 to 10. So most free is 10, least free is 0. And in each of those 3 areas, we average those scores to get 3 area scores. Those are all equally weighted. And then we just take the average of those 3, and that gives you the overall measure. So that's what we're working with when we look at the score. The score in the most recent report, now there's a 2-year lag in the data. So the report that came out in 2014 is for data from 2012. The overall score is about 6.5, up from 6.4 in 2011, and down from a peak of 6.9. This is kind of the pattern. There's been a general upward trend, but with some bumps in the road, of course. Especially since 2005 or so. And this is the cover. It's color-coded so that those, I don't know if that's SMU blue or not that Texas has there, but the blue states are the most free. That lighter blue is the second group. Green, peaches, I don't know what they call it, pink, and then red. The red states have a different connotation in this situation. We've got New York, New Jersey, California. No big surprise there. Those are some of the least free states. Okay, so the main thing I was asked to talk about is how does Texas, what about this Texas model? Well, Texas ranks first, you'll be happy to know, and you probably aren't surprised. For the last seven of the last 8 years, Texas has been either first or second. And again, if you want to get this report, you can go to freetheworld.com and click on subnational reports, or just put in the little slash and go fna.html. So if you throw in the Texas score, with the exception of the first tail over here on the left, in recent years, it more or less tracks the average, but of course a lot higher because things are a lot freer here in Texas. All right, so walking through the 3 areas briefly, Texas ranks best on government spending. They rank first there, second on that first variable, second on the second one, and 5th on the 3rd one. On taxes, Texas ranks 4th. We set up a network of state think tanks similar to what Bob does with the national think tanks around the globe. And we got some good feedback that is actually we're going to be tweaking this in the coming years because as you'll see, there's kind of a built-in bias in some ways against the no income tax states. So you've got Texas does great, of course, perfect score on the income tax rate variable, but you got to get the revenue from somewhere. And so on those other 2 variables, they score a lot worse. So there's always room for improvement, another way to look at that. On labor market freedom, Texas ranks 3rd, 10th on the minimum wage variable, 14th on government employees, and 19th on union density. Now, most importantly, why should we care, right? Why does it matter that economic freedom is high some places, low others? There's been decades of literature on this, most of it building on the report of countries that Bob has done because it's been around longer. They have a bigger sample of about almost 150 countries or so now. But there's been consistent support consistent findings of a positive relationship between economic freedom and things like GDP, the growth of GDP, even the income share of the poorest 10%, kind of an inequality measure. There tends to be less inequality when there's higher economic freedom, and a whole host of other things beyond even kind of economic outcomes to things like civil liberties and political freedoms. And there tend to be lower bad things like unemployment, corruption, et cetera. A lot of you have probably seen this picture. One of the things that people will say is, well, this economic freedom stuff, maybe that's not really what's driving it. Maybe it's just geography, right? We don't have access in some of these poorer countries to resources. Well, the Korean Peninsula is shared by 2 countries, and this is a nighttime satellite photo. The South Korea is lit up like a Christmas tree, and with the exception of Pyongyang, where the dictator lives, North Korea is dark. And so it'd be hard to say they don't share the same resources, but they certainly don't share the same institutions. And freedom, there's much greater freedom in the South than the North. When you look at countries, this 150 or so countries that they include in their database, the economic freedom of the world, you can see that in the most free quartile, in other words, the most free fourth, incomes are way up there. This is an income per person. So about 36,000. In the least free, it's closer to 5,000. Now they get a broader diversity of countries than we do of states, so you don't see quite that same diversity when you look at states. When you look at states, kind of a different way to look at it here is looking at the growth in economic freedom. So as you move off to the right in the graph, you're getting areas with more rapidly growing economic freedom. And the vertical is looking at the growth of GDP. And so you'll see this positive relationship here. Countries that have faster increases in freedom have faster increases in GDP as well. And finally, and I know Michael's going to talk about this in a little bit, I put together a local level index a couple of years ago, which I'm looking forward to expanding once I get here and have more time. But this is a look at that index, looking at the least free having an unemployment rate of close to 7%, whereas the most free is closer to 5%. So no matter how you look at it, it's not countries, it's not states, it's not metro areas, it's all of them. You get this positive relationship between economic freedom and good outcomes. A couple highlights from last year's report. When you look at the top group of states, the most free states, they had incomes of about $55,000 versus only about $48,000 in the poorest states, in the least free states. Another way to look at it is take a top 10, bottom 10 approach. In the most free top 10, population over the last 5 years has grown by 5%. In the least free 10, it's only grown by less than 2%. The Tax Foundation put together this map looking at how personal income migrates, not just people, but the income they take with them. And so this is from 2000 to 2010. And the color coding maybe jumps out at you. Green is the states that get the biggest influx of income. Purple, which may be hard to see, but California, New York, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, or purple, are the ones that had the biggest outpouring of personal income, of essentially financial capital. And so this matches up nicely. I wish I had a way to put them both on the same page with the economic freedom. The green states tend to be more free. Purple states tend to be very unfree. So over the last 5 years, I took a look at some data yesterday at the economic growth record of Texas, the number one state for economic freedom. And what I found is that they're right up there at the top in 4 different measures of economic growth. Now, they're not number one. They're behind kind of an outlier, North Dakota, with the big boom in the natural gas industry they've had. But they're also up there. North Dakota is also up there, number 3 in the EFNA report. So Texas is 2 in population growth, employment growth, GDP growth, personal income growth. No matter how you slice it, Texas is free, Texas is growing. Now the anti-Texas model, this worked out very well. The least free state is Maine. Over the last 5 years, they are last in those 4 measures with the exception of employment growth where they're next to last, behind only New Mexico, which is also down there in the bottom 10. So you've got Texas with high freedom and high growth, Maine with low freedom and low growth. And so what we have here is throwing in the U.S. average. You can see that not only is Texas well above Maine, which is the green state in this graph, but they're also above the U.S. average. They're leading the nation in economic growth and leading the nation in economic freedom. And this is just another slice of that where you see GDP growth is double the national average and basically quadruple Maine, the the least free state. Personal income, about the same pattern. My second favorite economist is Adam Smith, and I don't like to read quotes, but I'm going to read you this one because I like it so much. No human wisdom or knowledge could ever be sufficient for the proper performance of the duty of superintending the industry of private people and of directing it towards the employments most suitable to the interests of the society. The way I read that, what Adam Smith was saying is that get government out of the way, increase economic freedom, let private individuals and entrepreneurs with their own capital at stake decide how to put their industries to use. And that is what Texas has been doing. And as Senator Graham said, there's always room for improvement, but that would be a subject of another talk. The Texas model shows that economic freedom leads to high economic growth, and the Economic Freedom of North America report confirms that. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have, but that's all I've got. Thank you. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Have any states lately taken any radical or made any changes that have resulted in a radical change in their ranking? And on that front, would Texas improve or not the ranking if we eliminated something like the Texas Enterprise Fund or the Illinois Association subsidies?
Right, so the second question first, those subsidies, everybody does it, unfortunately, and every state says, well, look, if we don't do it, they're doing it, so we can't stop, but my home state of Florida does all that stuff too. Yes, that would help because it's a form of government spending. If you got rid of that government spending and gave that money back to the taxpayer, if you just spent it on something else, it wouldn't help. But if you gave that money back to the taxpayer, that would raise them on the spending side. As to your first question, there's a 2-year lag in the data, but there's some. The one that jumps out at me because I gave a talk in Detroit last year is Michigan. Right, they've done some things to reform with unions, and I think they've moved to a right-to-work state, if I'm getting my facts straight here. And other states like Wisconsin have done that same thing. So those kinds of things on the Area 3, where we look at labor market freedom, are going to move them up. And they've made some other reforms there, I know in Michigan, that are pushing them up. Farther from the bottom, I should say. Yep. Rick.
Do you have a operational theory about why some states end up high on the freedom list and some states end up low?
Yes. You want me to tell you what it is? Yeah. So look, states that have high levels of spending and taxes. Maybe you're looking kind of more, asking me to go more deep. Why do they have high levels of spending and taxes? And I would say, sure, there are different cultures, right? There are different political cultures in the Northeast versus Texas and Florida and the Sun Belt. And I believe that political culture is driving, in a sense, to the extent voters have any impact, is driving the policies that then show up as good or bad on this index. So yeah, I think it comes down to a difference in culture in some ways. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I like the chart on the movement of people between states. I'm not from Texas, but I got here as soon as I could. So I'm wondering, over the 30 years, have you seen people moving from less free states to free states? And is that starting to erode some of the freedom in some of those states? And people are chasing the wealth, but they don't understand what made it.
So maybe kind of tying into Rick's question in the sense that if it's culture that drives it and you've got these people from the less free states coming down here, I would say, I can't say that I've seen it, but I would say the people fleeing these big tax, low freedom states probably don't maybe share that same culture. Maybe that's why they're leaving, right? They don't necessarily have that same culture. So I can't say that I have seen that happening. Certainly, I guess you could say it would be a risk, but growth is good, right? It contributes to the expansion of the economy, and so I think in general it's a positive thing. There we go.
Yes, sir. Point of clarification. You mentioned that Mexico was included for the first time in 2014. Did you go back to the beginning of the data? And are these rankings only among U.S. states or are they among all the states above?
Good question. Good question. So there's two indices, and the one where we compare Texas to Canada to the U.S. is not so appropriate for comparing Texas to Florida to California. So in the index that I'm focusing on today, it's not directly comparable to the Mexican states. We're just looking at state and local issues, not the federal piece tagged onto that. And we did go back. So every year, the new report has data back to 1981, although for Mexico, I think we're only back to 2000 or 2003 maybe. But yeah, every year we update. If there's any revisions, we update the previous years. There we go.
In the context of Texas being all that it can be, regardless of being ranked number one, what one thing might you advise or ponder for getting government out of the way so that Texas could be even better?
Ask me in a year after I've been here a while, but no, I would say that the thing that the gentleman over there brought up about the enterprise fund, I'd say that those are the sorts of things, almost kind of cronyism stuff that really should be gotten rid of by everyone, where you're doling out money to these big companies to get them to expand their operations, to get them to move here, and I would argue that that's not necessarily a good thing, that money could be used better by the individual entrepreneurs and especially the small businesses who don't get these big sweetheart deals in their own decisions and expanding their own business if you let them keep more of their own money. Yes, sir.
You had mentioned you put together an index that was on metropolitan areas. And if you look at those, that index, does it correlate highly just at the state level, or do you have some cities that outperform despite being in a less free state?
Sure. So you get, and unfortunately, Michael Cox is going to talk in detail about that index here in a minute, so I won't go too far there. I don't want to steal his thunder. But ultimately, yeah, there's a great diversity within states. And the one I'm familiar with in my home state, Miami is a lot less free than Tampa, for example. So you do see this variation, which was the whole point of putting it together, that just saying Texas and Florida is better than saying, no offense, Bob, U.S. and Canada. But take it down even farther. Texas isn't one thing, right? It's huge, of course. I think there was one over here. Yes, ma'am?
You can make a comparison with Texas being your most free state to a state of similar resources, let's just say Pennsylvania right now in oil and gas. You mentioned North Dakota being freer recently or becoming a more free state. It also sort of ties into the statement over here to the right about are people coming into this prosperous area and then making changes that would make it less free. So about a comparison, particularly with oil and gas prosperity, or i.e. resources, between Texas and, say, Pennsylvania.
So the policies in place in Pennsylvania are very different in regard to that industry, and I think that's a large explanatory factor in the difference in economic profiles and economic performance in those two states. I can't say that my level of knowledge on that is all that deep, so I won't go farther than that, but I think that certainly policies matter, and that's part of the point of putting together this index. Yes, sir.
If there was an extended drop in oil prices, like going back to the 50s, is this model at risk in any way, that Texas being economically free, et cetera? I mean, if you look at it in the 80s, was that impacted?
Well, the one thing I would add on that is that we do net out the severance tax revenue. There's a handful of states, Texas is one of them, Alaska's really big on this, because of the fluctuations that you get from year to year due to oil prices or what have you. So we do net that out on the revenue side. Of course, it's there in the money they spend. But that's an interesting question that our network of state think tanks we're building would be really helpful in helping us address to make sure that we are tweaking the measure to handle that. At the moment, I don't have a better answer for you. Sorry. 1 minute. 1 minute left. Yes, sir. In the light brown there.
What do you chart the actions taken in the state of Texas between 1984 and 2000? What causes this prolonged dip and then slowly coming out? Was there actions that were taken to go bring it down and then slowly climb out?
That's a really good question. In 1984, I think I was 15. I'm not really sure what was going on in Texas in 1984. I should look into that. But what was going on? You were here, I assume.
I was not here, but every one of these things, you have states and you have areas that are going down a long time, and then they start to come up.
Sure.
Very
Well, absolutely. So at the beginning here, you're right. It's defying the national average is generally going up, and the Texas is going down. And when I put this together, I thought, I wonder why that is. I still think that. Sorry about that. All right, I think my time is up. All right.
Thank you. Good job. How many people are here are born in Texas? Less than half of the audience. How many people are out from outside of Texas? More than half. I'm from Arkansas, Little Rock. Came here, the license plates used to say, when I was growing up riding my bicycle, our garage was full of these license plates, land of opportunity. Now they're called the natural state. I moved here for the opportunity. I was pre-selected by a system that chose me, and I chose it. And so I think if most of us are like me, here studying economic freedom, we don't have to worry too much about transplants from other places which are less economically free. Let me get started. This is a chart showing you an index form GDP of Texas' 4 major cities: Houston, Dallas DFW, Austin, San Antonio, and then also I put in here Midland. Did you know that Dallas and Houston are each $515 billion economies? Let me put that in perspective. That puts us up with such nations, bigger than Switzerland by 10%, bigger than Sweden by about 20%, bigger than the Ukraine. We're 50% larger than all of Norway, 80% larger than Greece. We're getting some help from Greece on that. In case you're wondering, Los Angeles is about 867 billion, which puts them up with all of Malaysia, and New York City about 1.6 trillion dollar economies, just a city. Now, does oil drive the Texas economy? Yeah, at one time. Today, no. That's what this shows you. It shows you that oil, which peaked at about $110 a barrel, close to 120 in the 1980s in current dollars, eventually fell to something around 20 or 30, and as it did, can everybody see this? Of course, the Midland economy, let's try to make this look like an oil color, went flat, down for a while, but this basically was, over this extended period, flat. Houston also suffered from it a little bit and then just remade itself, started growing. Austin, tech economy, tech boom, just blip. This would have probably been state revenues from oil for a while. Dallas kept going up. San Antonio kept going up. It was during the period that oil prices were the lowest in Texas that we grew the fastest. These are the state's growth rates. We had a recession when oil prices came down, but this happens to be in the same year that the U.S. was in a recession. So it was probably tied more to that than our oil decline. We remade our economy away from oil to something else because we had the freedom and the flexibility to do that. As a share of employment, certainly Midland is an oil-driven economy, but Houston has 5% less than 5% of its employment in mining. Texas overall about 3%. Dallas-Fort Worth is so low that they won't give you the data because the BEA is afraid you'll figure out which exact company or two that is, and they can't do it. Now, oil's going up, reaches a peak about right here. Employment continues to grow in all these 5 cities, which are the 4 major ones in Midland. By the way, Dallas, the Dallas-Fort Worth economy, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin are 76% of the entire state's GDP. Only 24% resides out. So I'm showing you these. I'm showing you basically Texas. Austin continues to grow past, as the oil prices come down to $50 a barrel, sometimes in the 40s. Certainly Midland goes into recession, but had a good month recently. Houston has been flat. Dallas is up, and San Antonio continuing to grow in terms of employment, with oil half of what it used to be. Maybe you think that we're highly dependent on oil and gas revenues in our budget. Well, they got down to as low as 1.8%. That's oil and gas. This was only 0.6% from oil. After a peak in the 1980s of 22%, has been as high recently as 8.4%. Oil alone about 6%. Gas hasn't been an issue. Maybe we should only look at the oil component. Our revenues don't come from oil taxes and so on. They come from other things the dean was referring to. I think you should put it back in there because This shows you we're not dependent on oil tax revenues anyway as a part of the state's budget. There was a lawyer occupancy tax in this state, which is probably ought to be higher, but it's one of the things we get a lot of revenue from that we don't, Final graph on this subject I'm going to show you has to do with how we remade our economy. As a share of Texas personal income, oil field revenues peaked in 1948 at 26%. Came back up again when oil prices increased to a high number in 81, 25%, got as low as 1.4%. This is the share of our revenue, of our income that comes from oil revenues in the field, went back up to 9%. In other words, we have remade our economy. Today, Texas' non-energy economy is 14.4 times larger than in 1948 when oil peaked, which means, to the dismay of a lot of folks from the Northeast who would like to see us die, we are not going to die. We're going to keep growing because something else is great about this state, and it's not oil. It's economic freedom. This is the economic freedom scores of states over time coming from the Economic Freedom of North America report of Dean's. Goes back to 81. We stay in the top most of the time, stay in the bottom. New York stays in the bottom. California is close to the bottom. Vermont, Maine, I think Maine is in the very bottom on the most recent report. Illinois has trended down, but we tend to stay in the top 10 most economically free states, and we're number one in the most recent report. The next report comes out in December, okay? Today I want to talk to you about our cities and our new annual report, which we just released. You have a copy of it in your packet, The Wealth of Cities. Our 2014-15 annual report is the sixth of a series of annual reports we've written here at the O'Neill Center. They're all good. You should look at them all. We focused on Dallas-Fort Worth here and the degree we're globalized there. This Texas economy there, why are so many people moving to Texas? I'll come to that in a second again, just a little bit. But most recently, we are focusing our attention on the wealth of cities. The title, of course, stealing from Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. I guess we're stealing from the wealth of, was Art Laffer, The Wealth of States. But we're stealing from Adam Smith, because if Smith were alive today, he would certainly notice that as the world has become more metropolitan, more urban, and less rural, if we're going to have wealth in a nation, it has to be driven by wealth in the cities, and the cities have to be economically free, lest the nation not be that way. In 1800, only about 6% of the population lives in cities. We'll get to where it'll be 6% in the country one day. I'm sure we're headed that way. This is where America lives, urban, not rural today. In 1950, the top 25% of the cities had 35% of the population. Now they have 41, and the numbers grow, of course, as you extend the metros from 25 to 100. As people move to the cities, of course, GDP moves to the cities. Today, 75% of the nation's gross domestic product is produced in 100 cities. And it's not just because the people live there, it's also because they're more productive. The average person who lives in one of the top 25 cities in America produces 85% more, 81% more than somebody who lives in the country. I believe it. Is my wife here? Maria, are you here? Okay, so Maria and I have a country house too, and we go to the lake on the weekends sometimes. We get there, we can't get anybody to do anything. And we call it the lake disease. Everybody calls it the lake disease. Oh man, the fish are biting today. I don't know if I want to work that hard. When we're in the city, we come back 5:30 in the morning. We get up, we work to 10 o'clock at night. Barry, I know you and Shana do the same thing. Barry's a friend of ours who's an oncologist. It's just work in the cities, and the data show it. We're productive. There's a lot of output per person. That's why we have our downstate Texas, and they have their upstate New York. We need a place to escape from the fact that we're working hard in the cities and being very productive. So the cities, are the wealth of the cities, the health of the cities, the economic health of the cities is important for the nation. So we took the data this year from Dean Stansel. This is it. I know just show you that this is Stansel's data. He sent me this great file, and I plowed through it with 381 metropolitan statistical areas and looked through it in the three measures of economic freedom he had. And here's what we find out. Among the 30 largest MSAs in America, Tampa is number 1, Houston is number 2. This is a measure of economic freedom that goes from 1 to 10. Nobody gets much above 8. Could be. We could do better. Everybody could do better. Dallas is 3rd, almost tied with Houston. If you separate Dallas from, this is DFW, if you separate Dallas from Fort Worth, we actually go above Houston. Fort Worth brings us down a little. Brooke. San Antonio, still on the top. Austin is not one of the top largest 30, so it's not on here. But anyway, there's the largest 30 MSAs. So today I want to look at the following question. How does economic freedom affect MSA's economic performance? And 7 different ways. GDP growth, job growth, cost of living, wages, unemployment, and income inequality and migration, starting with GDP growth. So I'm going to, and for the next 7 slides or so, more than that, I'll show you I'm going to take all those 100 MSAs, the top 20 most economically free are going to be on this side, and the least economically free are going to be on that side. How does economic freedom go in this direction affect GDP growth? The answer is the freest 20% of states had 30% growth over the 12 years from 2001 to 2013. Generally, there's a downward trend, not perfectly in line, but there's a downward trend toward the ones with the lowest freedom having the lowest performance in terms of GDP growth. It's especially true with job creation. The freest 20% of the MSAs created 17.2% more jobs over this time period from 2001 to 2014. The least free, only a 4.4. Generally a downward trend. Job creation is what you really get out of economic freedom in a place. Cost of living falls as you get toward more economically free MSAs. Now the cost of living I have here is a new thing we came up with. It was painstakingly took the time to calculate the cost of living in terms of your tax bill and the prices that you pay for things. So take $1, wherever it's earned, subtract the tax rate, wind up with, say if you had a 30% tax rate overall, wind up with 70 cents, and then see how far that goes when you spend it at the prices in the local area. So that's the tax and price adjusted cost of living is the lowest in the most economically free states and by far the highest in the least free states. It's expensive, especially housing is expensive, but just about everything is expensive. A dollar goes a lot further in free states once earned than it does in the least free states. Here is the cost of living index of all 50 states in case you're interested. The most expensive place to live as far as MSAs go is New York and Honolulu, San Francisco, and so on. Dallas makes it about to the 75th percentile, about 3/4 of the way down. Houston, San Antonio, Austin. You can see where the cities stack out. And of course, people move for that. They move for a cheaper place to live and raise the family. One interesting thing you find, and you look at the data, is that a lot of people have moved to Texas, but Texas doesn't have nearly as many jobs creation over this period as it has people we've gained. That was a puzzling phenomenon we found in the data. Why we added so much more people in migration, but not so many more jobs? The answer is because 2 people might have to work in one state. You can come here. One of them can not work. Cost of living is so much lower. You can free up an individual to take care of the kids or do whatever. So that's the data for cities individually. What about wages? These are wages adjusted for taxes and prices. The highest 5th. Well, New York brags about high wages, but you know what? Once you adjust those wages for the cost of living, they actually get paid less in terms of their living standard. The highest 5th is the second 5th in this case, but again, you see the pattern of income going further in free states than not free ones. Unemployment rate is the lowest here, but there's this general upward trend toward the unemployment rate being higher in places with less economic freedom and lower in places with more economic freedom. Income inequality is the lowest in the middle. Middle is always weird for a lot of things. You have to kind of look at who's in there. It's Philadelphia and some places. But You see this trend toward states with more economic freedom having higher median, less income inequality. And then finally, migration. Another thing that happens apart from job creation is migration. People are definitely migrating toward the most economically free fifth of America's MSAs. And you see it in this data. The most free 20% of the 100 MSAs have gained about 9,000 people, 9 million people over this 20-year time period, whereas the least free have lost around 7 million. That's measured in absolute number of people. The same thing comes out when you look at the percent migration as a percent of the population who lives there. Freer MSAs are definitely the ones adding the people, and less free ones are the ones losing people. Specific cities to look at in this case, the winners, adding the most people: Atlanta, Phoenix, Riverside, Dallas, fourth, and so on. A lot of Florida cities losing folks: New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco. What you would expect. I mean, with a 13.3% state income tax at the margin for incomes over $250,000 in California. So clearly the answer to this question is what makes an MSA economically strong is economic freedom, of course. And that's why we see over and over. If you've been living here for not long at all, you've noticed, look at all these people moving in, all these corporate relocations. Every day Al tells me of a new one that's going on over and over again, and driving up our property values and providing jobs and so on. Here's a map of just some of the migration of companies to this area, and this stopped about 1.5 years ago. I need to ask for an update of this from this place. It was nice to give it to us here, because more has happened even since then. More corporate relocations to this area. It's been wonderful. And so economic freedom is important, but you know what? Other things, of course, matter too. Amenities matter. The mountains, the beach, amusement and theme parks, professional sports team. Why do we move to the cities? Why do we live here? Golf courses, country clubs, hotels, the theater. This middle slice here, I love New York. I do heart New York. I love to go to the theater. And dance companies and museums. I like the marinas, that Miami and other places offer. Fitness and rec centers are amenities that cities can have. Historical sites, that's the Alamo down there. Zoos, botanical gardens, the Arboretum. Artists, musical groups. Fine dance, fine dinner, fine dining. Racetracks, local sports clubs and teams. Last but not least, bars. Attractions of the city you don't find in the country. We love it. It just makes the city a rich place to live with things that, smart people need to have. Well, we decided to rank all these 20 amenities using data from the county business patterns, and just too much to look at. But I'll tell you that if you just look at the red here, New York always wins. We weighted this on the basis of, we partly compensated for the fact that, of course, New York is bigger. And so we give a 75% weight to the number of amenities you had and a 25% weight to the number of amenities you had relative to the population to adjust for crowding, and still New York wins. New York, New York, New York, New York, and the red comes in 19 out of 20 of these amenities. Los Angeles comes in the top 15 and 20 out of 20. Dallas in blue, only 6. Amenities are what keep a people in a city and attract people to it, makes it a great place to live. We all have the favorite things that we like to think about and talk about our city, and they are the amenities. Wise municipal governments take a plus, the MSA's amenities, and match it with another plus, low taxes, and other forms of economic freedom, and that way attract people and businesses from other parts of the nation. Unwise ones take a plus, attractive amenities, the mountains, the beach, and so on, and use that as leverage to raise taxes. The problem is that many people value the economic freedom more than they do the amenities, and so they leave. Moreover, there's no mechanism for turning this off. This is something Fred McMahon told us, the Economic Freedom of the World guy. There's no mechanism for turning this behavior off apart from perhaps massive population exodus. And that's what goes on. So we wrote about this, Rick and I did, in our most recent DCEO article called The Paradox of Amenities. If you look at the data, you will find people leaving the cities in which there are high levels of amenities. It's not because they don't like the amenities, it's because government raises taxes in most of those cities by enough to run the people off. A second thing, of course, that matters, when we lost Mercedes to Georgia, that was a big blow. Al asked me to sit on a committee to try to attract some unknown business here, and we tried and tried and tried, but we didn't get them. They wanted the Atlanta airport and the proximity to East Coast flights back over to Germany, and so we lost them. And we set out on a project to kind of measure an MSA's airport resources, and so we came up with a new measure of resources, of airport resources, not focused on the airport, but focused on the MSAs. How much access do you have to good airports, which go to places all over the world with a lot of flights and so on? We undertook an effort to measure an MSA's airport resources, starting with how close are the airports to the urban center. I mean, look, Denver is really far away from the city. But, it's nice to have these airports close in. Love Field, Dallas, Fort Worth is not that far. It's in between Dallas and Fort Worth. And so proximity to the city center, also the extent of domestic air services. How many unique cities other MSAs do you fly to with a nonstop flight? How many domestic flights do you offer weekly? And how many passenger enplanements, boardings are there from that particular city? Not people flying through, but flights people who board there in that city. We looked at that for domestic, same thing international. DFW, for example, has 89 unique foreign destinations where you can go to sleep and wake up in Tokyo or Hong Kong. And then also the growth in airport services. It's good for these services to be growing over time. That's an indication that they'll be there for you if you're looking to move to a city. Well, is the airport service growing or shrinking? They're shrinking in Detroit. They're growing here in Dallas. Now, this is the way it turned out. The top 12 for domestic air service and international air service. Destinations, Dallas is third, New York sixth. Flights, boardings, international, of course, with JFK, New York wins on international flights that they offer. Always there you'll find, of course, New York, most of the time Los Angeles, but also Dallas with good airport service. And this is, once we measured this thing and put it on a 0 to 100 scale, Dallas-Fort Worth Airport comes in fourth. It's good that we're in the middle of the country too. For that, flying from the coast, you only fly generally in one direction, and that's kind of what brings Los Angeles down. They're on the coast, and so, all right. So I just want to tell you before I conclude here that go take a look at our Wealth of Cities annual report. This is the 6th of our annual report series. Also, please follow us in the DCEO publications. Rick and I have published about 20 these DCEO articles so far. Our next one will be the one on the airports. We've already written that up. That comes out in a month or two. And we now, with Dean's arrival in January, will be the home of where the intellectual work on this occurs. It comes from the Fraser Institute, but the principal author, Dean, will be here for our 2014 report in December. Bob, of course, has the Economic Freedom of the World reports. The 15 report is just out. You'll be dismayed to know U.S. has fallen from number 1, if you don't include Hong Kong, because Hong Kong's not a country, in the year 2000 to, I think, number 15 or 16 now, depends on whether you do or don't include Hong Kong. We're almost in free fall, and that's before the latest numbers come in. And thank you.
To what extent can you correlate the success of the city to its public school system?
To what extent can you correlate the success of the city to its public school system? Quite highly. And by the way, our report from 2 years ago, which was called Rebuilding America's Middle Class, does that. We look at how good Texas's public schools are, and all the public schools all by state. If you look at the data at the state level, Texas has the 28th best public schools in the system, starting with 1, Massachusetts, 20, we're 28th. The problem is, not the problem is, the thing is, if you disaggregate the data and you look at it, whites compared to whites, we're 4th. Blacks compared to blacks, we're 3rd. Hispanics compared to Hispanics, we're, I think, 7th. So how do we get to be 28th? Well, the answer is the populations vary tremendously from state to state. Vermont's 99% white kids in their school. Mississippi is 70-something% black in their public schools. So if you let the populations vary from state to state, and if there's any variation in the performance of the students by race, which there is, white students tend to score in a range here, Hispanics here, and blacks here. You cannot, in a statistical study, let two things vary and make an inference as to one. So holding the student populations constant across states, what we find out, and you redo the data, is that we wind up coming to 3rd.
Where does the city of Dallas sit?
That's a good question. I have that data, and if you just send me an email, I'll send it to you. We have that information on our schools. Pretty high. Dallas has pretty good public school systems, all things considered, compared to other public school systems in the nation. Our daughter, for example, goes to a Montessori public school called Dealey, which we're very happy with. We actually also, by some measures, have more competition than other schools. We reject things like Common Core. We have pretty good public schools. But the thing is, of course, we have good private schools too. And you know the average private school, the average public school, the tuition is $13,500 is the average cost per student. And you know how much our private schools cost on average in the country? $8,900. Less than public schools. Hey, Baron. Yes, sir.
Okay, so of course, the aspect from Dean Nemai back in June, some of the statistics that he presented suggested that as people move to urban areas and populations become more concentrated within this country, they tend to vote for less freedom, greater government involvement, higher taxes and such, unless I misunderstood the data. Do you have data that correlates to that? I mean, is that?
I do not, but Al does.
Hey, Buddy. Buddy was in a class I taught my certificate in American capitalism at the end of May, and I was sharing some demographic data. There are 3 states in America now that are minority dominant. California is 41% white non-Hispanic. New Mexico is 41% white non-Hispanic. And Texas is 46% white non-Hispanic. Some of my friends over in the political science department are projecting and pointing out that California was the state that gave us Ronald Reagan. And they're arguing that in 12 to 16 years, if the voting patterns over the last 2 national elections hold, where 99% of African Americans voted Democratic, 78% of Hispanic voters voted Democratic, 72% of Asian voters voted Democratic. Unless those change, what I was arguing was some of my political science friends say Texas becomes the next big blue state. And that could happen. And that's just in the numbers. So we have to change the culture. But that's my aside on that. And I probably killed your time, Michael, and took you to break.
Actually, you brought up something very important. We have to change the culture. And so with the support of a longtime friend of mine, Dick Weekly, in Houston, Weekly Homes, guess what we're doing? We're starting a program. And what's our first date? Where's Rick? February. We're starting a program to teach the teachers in Texas free market economics. We're specifically centering on school districts which are largely Hispanic. We're going into these schools and teaching them free market economics. Now, fortunately, we have the help of a new state mandate which requires that the students be taught free market economics. It's awesome. And so we've designed the program. We take the research Rick and I and Bob have been working on for years to the people, teach the teachers. For every one teacher you teach, you're teaching 200 students. It eventually gets to. Thank Dick Weekly. And we're looking for, by the way, some sponsors for that as well. Others, to match his gift. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
One of the things I think is interesting about North America is the presence of a relatively large number of big cross-border metro areas. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is there a special dynamic that arises from the cross-border nature of a metro area like Hassel Large?
Yeah. I don't have data on that. It would be an interesting study. Yeah, there's a lot of cities like that. I mean, they've become a little dysfunctional, of course, in the past, but they're recovering now that the drug stuff is settling down a little bit in Mexico. But it would be, the answer is I don't have data on that. If you have some good ideas about it, come see me during the break, which we can take in 2 minutes. Yes, sir.
Quick question. Have you had a chance to work with Dean Stansel yet on the economic freedom of North America and see how closely they're tied? How are you able to separate those out?
I know, but I'm really looking forward to that. I need that to hear myself. Dean, this thing he and I talked about this just a minute ago before we started. I think the most valuable part of that Economic Freedom of North America report for us is freedom of Mexico. And what happens, let me just say this and I'll stop. What happens when this happened when they created an index for India, right? And they broke up all the states in India and the Freedom Index was put for every state. They started competing with each other to become more economically free. We hope that happens with the measurement of the states in Mexico, and then we can raise their economic freedom just through a vehicle like this, just through the data, just through measuring data. It makes a tremendous difference. Okay, 30 seconds.
Former Governor Kerry talked about change in the graduation rate of Hispanic and African American populations going from very low to number 2 in the country during that 14-year time period. What did Texas do differently than other states to cause that dramatic rise, if you agree with that?
I saw that in the data. It is amazing when you look at that. The graduation rates of our Hispanic students are among the highest in the nation, if not the highest. I think that we didn't give them a bunch of handouts. I mean, we are a very low welfare state. That if you're going to make it here, you're going to make it on your own cause. And I think that's an important thing, is that you stop pulling the wagon and you let people get out and learn how to walk on their own 2 feet. Thank you.